Hey, Tehseen. Really excited to kick things off today. I remember speaking with you for the first time as a part of our Merge Club onboarding call, and ever since we had that conversation, I've been dying to get on a podcast with you and sort of dive deeper into what you've been up to. And so I know that we have quite a bit to get into that you've been up to more recently, but it might be interesting to sort of turn back the clock and hear sort of how you got started on the path that you are today. What was your environment like? Who were the people involved in your your story then? That sort of kick things off.
Yeah, awesome. I'm excited to jump into it. I've been a fan of the work that you guys have been doing for a little bit, so it's pretty surreal to finally get the chance to talk to you guys. So about my kind of surroundings and background, I think there are really two things that were pretty transformative in how I got interested in technology and working on impactful problems. They came kind of sequentially throughout high school. The first one was just like global travel. My family's from Tanzania, and when I was in 10th grade, I spent 2 months in Tanzania by myself. Like essentially, what I was doing there is teaching English at an orphanage, and I was living with the students, and it was a very immersive experience. So from there, I got to see a lot of the issues that kind of like we talk about when it comes to like a lot of the UN like sustainable development goals. We talk about them from like a macro lens. I got to like kind of live that reality and understand like what it's like to live, for example, without internet access or with like limited access to clean water on a day-to-day basis. And spending those 2 months got me interested in like basically how do these governments run and what are the incentives that bigger companies have in those regions to help provide those kind of like fundamental necessities, and essentially why are we not progressing at the same rate as say other countries. So that was one pretty transformative experience, got me very curious. And then the second one was joining the Knowledge Society in high school. That took a lot of my curiosities and gave me a channeled way to actually execute on ways to solve a lot of these problems. So I was exposed to a lot of different technologies, a lot of different smart people from really all over the world. And through those different channels, I was able to learn about how I can actually solve those problems, who I can work with to solve those problems, and like the better questions to ask to better understand the problems.
What were some of those great questions to ask to better understand problems? Seems like oftentimes people ask the questions that they think will get them the answers they want, not necessarily get them more information. What have you learned on that?
Yeah, the biggest thing for me is like understanding two things. One is like how things work and why do they work that way. So for the instance of like me spending time in Tanzania, I was very curious about specifically the fact that like internet access was very limited in the area that I was in. So that got me curious about like what are the companies that manage internet access, and what I learned is that it's very like governmentally run rather than more privatized like in the United States and North America. That got me curious about like what's the history there, like why governmentally run versus privatized, and then beyond that, like what technologies are actually used in North America versus sub-Saharan Africa and East Africa. And like it's really those two questions: how does something work, and why does it work that way?
And sort of coming back from the trip in Tanzania, what was your perspective on like next steps? I mean, you mentioned that you were there to teach English and how you were sort of witnessing a lot of the things that we all hear about in news articles and on television. How did that translate into action and sort of, the research you mentioned, and then maybe working to make a difference?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I came back from Tanzania, I was very curious about like this idea of decentralization and government corruption, because what I found is that a lot of the costs that you have when traveling through a place like Tanzania or living there, it basically like there's almost like a bribery tax that's involved in a lot of the transactions that you make on a day-to-day basis, and you're used to it, so it's kind of like incorporated in like what you expect from a day. And that kind of got me interested in like this idea of taking power from a centralized entity and like decentralizing it. So that kind of was my foray into blockchain technology. So I looked into like decentralized financial networks, and I worked in like DeFi infrastructure because I felt that like for something like DeFi or basically crypto to work, you need better infrastructure to solve like a scalability and a speed problem. So I started to look into that, and I got very curious about the technology itself. Beyond that, I was also very curious, like I spoke about internet access. Like I said, like why is internet access not up to par like it is in North America? And from there, I started to look at like the very fundamentals of internet networking and the protocols that basically underpin the internet in North America. And I found that the technology itself is incredibly archaic. It's not something that people are incentivized to iterate on because it's essentially oligopolized. And there are a few entities that make a lot of decisions that essentially control how the internet works in North America. What I started to look at is like, how can we use like modern machine learning methods to optimize how data packets are sent across internet networks to essentially take this old technology and create some optimizations that we can speed up how data is sent across a network without drastically increasing costs. And the idea was to understand how it works in North America such that eventually it can be scaled to a place like sub-Saharan Africa.
I'd actually love to hear more about like what you found out in that research and the work that you did on that. Like, speak more to the incentives, the incentive structures and how just like things work in that industry, the archaic sort of systems set up, and why people don't change them.
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially the internet works by sending data packets from data centers to like the final place. So for example, like my laptop here where I'm streaming this call, by jumping through different autonomous systems across basically a country, those autonomous systems are controlled by different entities. So for example, okay, the first ones that come to mind are Canadian, but I'm trying to give an American example. But like, let's take, for example, like T-Mobile or AT&T. They would control different autonomous systems across a country, and as a result, when data is being sent across, like through these different internet service providers, autonomous systems, there are certain rules essentially that these companies create, such that data is sent through, for example, like only their autonomous systems, or it's sent to optimize for like a specific metric that contributes to like their monthly goals, for example. And as a result, data doesn't always take the most efficient path to get from point A to point B because of these different financial incentives. What I started to figure out is that if we can have some sort of like dynamic routing algorithm such that data can make a more efficient decision about how to route to get from point A to point B, essentially what we could do is we can try to better route this data more efficiently without having to deal with like the different autonomous system regulations that these like traditional internet service providers institute.
Historically, how have you decided what to work on? And how has that process of deciding what to work on changed over time?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think early on, I was very much fell victim to spreading myself too thin because I found curiosity in a lot of different areas. And because there was so much like information that I was learning about when it came to technology and big problems, I would often jump from project to project quickly because I find like a shiny object essentially. What I learned there is that this is like a kind of a corny quote, but like your curiosity and your interest is formed through experience rather than exclusively seeing something shiny. And essentially, what that means in practice is that what you actually feel great about working on is not going to come until you work on something for a prolonged period of time and actually experience the hurdles of running into a technical roadblock or figuring out that something might be much more expensive than you thought it would be. What that has done for me is it's taught me that if I find a project I'm genuinely interested in on a surface level, I need to spend at least a few months, at least like 3 months to actually start running into roadblocks before I jump to something new because I don't actually completely understand what I'm working on or what it entails. It's that process of like finding something you're curious about, but then actually like realizing that there is a lot more beyond just that cool shiny object.
Would you say it's also some aspect of how you feel when you encounter the challenges associated with the work? Some people, let's say a musician, has a different type of challenge when they're trying to learn a song or learn some technique than maybe someone who is trying to fix a bug in a computer program. Some people will really enjoy the challenge of one and really hate the challenge of another. Is it something kind of like that, or is there something else there?
Yeah, I think that's the best way to put it. Like there are like different types of people enjoy facing different challenges. Like you said, someone may enjoy like, trying to optimize their code to fix for certain bugs, whereas someone else might enjoy, for example, the process of trying to get around like specific legal regulations and trying to be creative in that sense. It's really different types of like problem solving to get through those challenges, and people's brains work in different ways. So understanding that about yourself is like a really crucial element of self-reflection.
And what have you discovered about yourself? What are the things that you've realized, hey, with time and sort of roadblocks, I've realized these are the types of things I enjoy working through that some people might hate working through. And these are the things that some people might love working through, but I really couldn't stand.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very difficult question. And while I can say in theory that I understand this idea of like trying to figure out exactly what you enjoy working through, I'm still figuring it out myself. But I think one thing I have learned over the past few years is that I really enjoy kind of like this idea of like third door type hustling and like trying to figure out how to get something that on the surface you can't get. Like there's just like no way you can do it if you try to like ask or go through the front door. So the idea of like reaching out to people, it's like cold outreach to people that are possibly connected to something that you could want, or doing something like completely out of left field to try to impress someone, or doing something that like solving a problem for someone before they ask the question to earn some sort of like outcome. I think I really enjoyed thinking through that process because it's the whole process of like, okay, I need something. How can I get it in a way that like they would not expect to essentially achieve that outcome? I really enjoy that creative process.
Do you have an example of something like that?
I do, which is it relates to a story that I have with LinkedIn, and I can talk about that story really quickly. Essentially, as a result of the project I did with internet networking, it was a highly technical project that required me reading a lot of research papers and trying to talk to a lot of really smart people and filling in my knowledge gaps that way. It was kind of like a two-step process. And over time, I started to realize that I struggled with finding the right people for like my specific technical questions because, like I discussed, internet networking is a relatively archaic technology where there are very few people who truly understand the inner workings of these different protocols. So I struggled with finding the right people to figure out these questions with me. And what I did was I started to think about a way that I could solve this problem for myself. And what I found is that if I were to create some sort of search engine that was essentially a search engine for people where you search for a skill, competency, or experience rather than in a person, and you get an expert in that specific area and you're able to reach out to them, you're essentially able to find mentors in like very specific niches that are incentivized to help you because you're asking the questions to the right person. I found that a lot of like mentorship doesn't work because oftentimes there's like incompatibilities because, for example, the mentee asks things that maybe the mentor is not an expert in or doesn't have specific experience in. So with this method, that essentially solves the problem. And here is where I kind of like got a little scrappy. I found that I couldn't build this product myself for two reasons. The first one being that building it requires scraping LinkedIn data in a way that they describe as like something that they would basically shut me down for. The second part I realized is that LinkedIn's specific position as like the professional social network actually gives them like a great opportunity here because this is something that users of LinkedIn would most likely be using. So what I did was I reached out to exact numbers like 60 people at LinkedIn. And this is across different domains, mostly in product management, but across a lot of different domains. And I got two responses back. What they essentially said is that, okay, this is really interesting. I like the concept, but like nothing else. Like basically cool, like nice. What do you want? So I continued emailing them. So after three emails, I got to one of the global head of business development who basically said, okay, this is cool. I want to talk to you for 15 minutes. You got 15 minutes. So I said, okay, I'm going to be in San Francisco in 2 weeks. I was not going to be in San Francisco in 2 weeks. But what I did was I worked with a couple of friends to basically get our trip funded by some individuals who helped us make this real. And we went to San Francisco and I was able to meet with the global head of business development in his office in Mountain View to basically speak about a potential partnership. Would LinkedIn want to work on this together, essentially to make this real for the company? And the outcome was basically like me being pushed around to a few different people. So from that, I was fortunate enough to be introduced to one of the co-founders of LinkedIn, Alan Blue, which I also spoke with over Zoom when I was back in Toronto. The biggest feedback I got from this was essentially to focus on solving, like for consumer technology, focus on solving a problem for people before technology. And what that means in practice is, in the case of mentorship, try to run some focus groups without any technology to understand, basically run this mentorship process of like speed dates and basically something with no technology to understand why people would want this and how they would actually use it. And then from there, building your technology would be much easier because you actually understand like how people would interact with it. And then I was told, if you do build this and you get users, we're gonna have to shut you down because you're scraping our data. So that was the end of the story there.
That is really, really cool. And I kind of want to dig deeper on like three parts of this. The first is what you might have taken away from your experience with the Knowledge Society that like led to this project even coming to mind. The second is how you went about financing a trip to San Francisco, how you were able to say I'll be there in 2 weeks, even though that wasn't what was initially planned. And the third is maybe what's next with the sort of the takeaways that you've gotten from the LinkedIn project. So I guess for starters, if you could sort of synthesize and mash up the key takeaways from your experience at TKS, what would those be?
Yeah, awesome. That question relates to kind of the long story I just gave you, which is like TGS does expose you to a lot of really great people, and it shows you kind of like this world that can be developed with technology. But the biggest takeaway for me is just that, like there's no real like world where like no is like a valid answer. You can really get whatever you want if you're creative enough. That like influenced a lot of my views now. Like I genuinely believe most things are accessible if you are creative enough and you really understand like the incentives of the other person. You put yourself in the other person's shoes to figure out how to get something. And like TS, like through a lot of like kind of like discomfort challenges and like promoting this throughout my 2 years with the program, I really align with this statement, and I really am fortunate to have learned it.
That's really interesting. And as far as like finding these 60 people at LinkedIn, is it fair to say that maybe you use LinkedIn to find those 60 people? That might not be obvious to some people who might just be starting out listening to this.
Yeah, part of it was LinkedIn, and part of it was like there are these like tools that you can get to basically find people's emails. Also, you can guess people's emails pretty easily because it's often first letter, last name, or first name, last name. And then eventually, when you see a profile picture pop up for their email, you found their email. So it's just a process of playing around with those tools.
Super cool. Yeah, I mean that's like a gem in and of itself. You find these 60 people, you're speaking with them, you finally get two to reply to you. You realized that right then and there, if you could say, I'm going to be in San Francisco in 2 weeks, you would actually finally get what you were looking for. What was the thought process of how to actually make that happen? You didn't finance it yourself. Obviously, it wasn't something that was already planned. How did that, come to be?
Yeah, so very fortunately enough, actually, I was at the same time working on getting some financing for my machine learning for internet networking project. And I got a grant from the 1517 fund, the Medici grant, had the money, and I was basically saying, like, I have this money to use for my internet networking project, but I don't need all this money. So what I did was I like very calculated with how I spent the money for my networking project, and that required me like purchasing simulation software. And from there, I was able to use what I needed from the simulation software and then like pretty much get my money back. Like, cause I ran a few tests, I was able to get my money back. So then I had my full sum of money from the Medici grant. And then I decided that I think this is a worthwhile expense for myself. And I think this is like something that if goes well, the potential upside could be worth the Medici grant. So I used that money to help finance the trip. I also had four other friends who were interested in going to San Francisco at the same time. So we packed ourselves into one hotel room, split the cost. It was very cost efficient in that sense. And it was a pretty transformative experience.
Was that your first time in SF?
That was my first time in San Francisco.
What was it like landing in SF, coming into the city? Tell us about your experience. Like literally, you get off the plane. What's the first thing you see? How do you feel?
Yeah, you worded that perfectly because I literally got off the plane and was immediately shocked because I ordered an Uber to like into the city from the airport, and my Uber driver shows up in like this really nice BMW, and I was very curious. I started talking to him. I started talking about kind of like, like how's the city, like where are you from, whatever. And then he starts explaining to me how he ran a crypto trading company for cross-border payments. And he was like a very smart person. Like he'd moved around LA and San Francisco, and he built his company to raise a Series A. And then one of his investors told him that he should put his money in FTX because that's where a lot of the investors holding company portfolio companies held their money. So he put all of his money in FTX. You know the story there. He lost everything. So he essentially folded the company, and now he's figuring out what to do next. So he's driving Ubers around San Francisco in the meantime.
Wow. Maybe say more about, like, you get to SF, you were staying, like, I think there are a lot of people here who, are listening, who either are coming to SF for the first time soon. You were staying at a hotel. My guess is that you were staying at a hotel in probably the worst neighborhood in San Francisco. What was your experience like, coming to SF, get downtown for the first time? And how long are you there? Like, just tell us about the trip, because I think it's interesting for people to hear somebody, who's coming from another country, come to San Francisco for the first time, experience the tech capital of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was there for 4 days, and in those 4 days, I probably slept for like a total of like 15 hours, just because like there are so many like people to see, there are so many things to see, and it's always like I think if you're like visiting, it's like very much a stimulating environment because of like this like almost like you feel like you're in a utopia when it comes to like thought. People are very forward thinking, like and any just like discussion you overhear likely has something to do with technology, or at least the future. And like for example, like I'm walking around my hotel, just like maybe grabbing some food late night, and I see like for example like the founder of Superhuman, which is like sitting on the phone like on a call next to me, and like to me that's insane coming from a city where you don't see that very often. So like genuinely, when I was in San Francisco, I packed myself with meeting people that I'd built connections with through my time in Toronto and in TKS. So I was able to speak with people who I initially worked with when I was doing crypto projects. I was able to speak with people who are interested in like internet networking, the next generation of how that would work, founders, researchers. Like it was just genuinely like a very interesting trip, and people are heavily opinionated about the future. So as a young person, it's really interesting to learn from.
What would you say is the advice that you'd give to people who are coming to San Francisco for the first time to kind of make the most of their time in San Francisco? It seems like you have digital distributed networks, through TKS, now through things like Merge. But there's this idea of what can you do kind of to front load some work so that you can make the time that you're in SF really impactful. In your case, you had 4 days. So maybe give advice for somebody who has 4 days, and then maybe try and give advice for somebody who has a month or something like that. How would you sort of do the work in advance to have a really good time?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, like you said, 4 days and the month are very different because in those 4 days, to be honest, like I did not do much work at all because I was like very much focused on like meeting people, getting feedback, and kind of like showing off the work I had done before. So that is like really important. Have something to show because I think San Francisco is unique and valuable in that like you get value based on like things you've done. And if you have something to show and you have something that you want targeted feedback on, or maybe you want to like acquire customers or raise money, of course, like that will get you a ton more value than if you go around like kind of like asking for coffee chats, for example. And I'd say like for pre-work, if you're working on something, try to get to a stage where you're comfortable with showing it off and comfortable with like acquiring users and getting feedback, because at that stage you will get like plenty of unfiltered feedback from people who are incredibly experienced in your domain. So that's like kind of step one, like build something or have something that you're interested in showing off and getting that feedback. Step two is just like curate a list of people that you want to speak with and have like a specific reason to speak with them. Like for me, I kind of jumped around a few different reasons. I had a lot of like kind of friends and people that I wanted to speak to from when I worked in crypto. So I was able to speak with them about that and talk about like some of the pet projects I had worked on. Same thing with my internet networking project. Same thing with the LinkedIn project that actually was there to work on. Those are the two things. Like reach out to specific people, be very specific about what you want and like how you're going to go about that chat. And then number two is like, yeah, have something that you're comfortable with showing off and want some feedback from.
And so you get back from San Francisco, you're in Toronto. What do those next months look like? Because I imagine, after the conversation that you had with the people at LinkedIn, sort of in this position of like, okay, I've been making progress on this idea. I finally made a huge leap forward. This conversation is leaving me feeling how, and sort of like what are your next steps?
Yeah, for sure. So there's two things there. Like leaving San Francisco, I was very energized by like this idea of like community and surrounding yourself by very curious, ambitious people. So I started to get more tapped in with Toronto's tech scene, which I think Toronto's tech scene is probably like has some incredible potential because actually when I was in San Francisco, I met so many people from Toronto. So there is this concept, and this is kind of like this meme in Toronto of like this brain drain. But I still think that Toronto has some incredibly talented people. I started to tap in more with like a bunch of communities in Toronto, which I can speak about more for people who are in Toronto and curious to get involved with them. And then the second thing is I was also very energized by this idea of consumer technology, which it's not something I'd really ventured into before. Everything I'd done has been more like infrastructure related. I had this feedback and I wanted to make use of it. So I started to build like my next project, which was essentially kind of like just a side project, just like it's a social accountability platform for founders called Daily. And this came about because a lot of my friends in group chats were doing like posting daily updates to each other with two intentions. One is to stay accountable, and the second one is that it allows you to stay up to date with friends, like when you're kind of heads down and working on something that's taking up a lot of your time. I essentially like productized it. So I built this platform where you post a daily update every day to your close friends. And it starts off with just your friends because there's that level of intimacy. And then you build up a streak on the platform. And with that streak, that counts as like your follower count, like you'd see on any other social media. And obviously, the higher streak you get, the more of like a social metric that you have to show there. And people are able to see your posts if you allow them to. So I think it's a great way to almost show like a more authentic portfolio in addition to that accountability. And like thinking about how I would build that came from a lot of like the lessons I learned from the people at LinkedIn who spoke about like before you build something, like actually test it without technology to see how people use it and like why they use it, when they use it, and all those important factors to actually get people to use your product once you build it.
And so you took those lessons that you learned, you applied it to this. From my understanding, applying this to this sort of thing that you productized sort of translated into seeing these group chats with your friends where it was happening already organically and then productizing it. But was that the full extent of testing it socially, or like what did that process look like sort of with these fresh learnings from the whole LinkedIn experience?
Yeah, for sure. That was the inspiration, kind of seeing it like happen in real time and realizing that I believe people will use this. From then, I started to kind of curate more of like an actual, like almost like testing environment. It's weird to say because it's like my friends. It's where I basically focused on trying to replicate exactly the features that I would implement, but without like the actual like product. So for example, this idea of like a streak and like what that would look like in a group chat, like kind of updating the streak when people post, and then when they don't post, like telling them, okay, you lost your streak. That's one example. Another example is this idea of like, do people prefer to post their updates in a bigger channel where there are more people and more people can see it, or do they prefer to keep it more intimate with a smaller group of friends, such that if, for example, they feel they didn't make as much progress, they don't have as like an impressive of an update per se, that they're still comfortable with posting that. I kind of tested those two things, and from there I was able to understand like what's the best environment for my product to fit in.
What would you say are the most counterintuitive ideas around streaks, sort of as a user experience element, as a game design function? What did you learn there that kind of surprised you?
So I found streaks as like growing up as kind of like this gamification fun thing because people are innately a little bit competitive, and building up that streak brings out that competitive edge in people. But the one thing I found quickly is that if there's no incentive tied to the streak, a lot of people just don't care because they realize the streak means nothing. The idea with this platform was that you build up a streak, it's publicly shown so people can see it as like kind of a marker of how you quote unquote like legit your project is, or how quote unquote hard you're working. And I found that oftentimes the people who use the product just don't care about the streak. They'll post when they want to post and they use it to see what their friends are doing, but their streak's not that important. So from that, I learned that a streak should lead to some sort of tangible benefit for the individual. So I thought about this. I thought about like, how can I actually provides some sort of benefit for the person who builds up this streak. So there's a reason they want to post. It's like some things I've thought of, which I haven't implemented yet, are like maybe partnering with someone like Notion to give out some sort of like discounts or benefits to people who get this streak. It's actually an idea I got from merch. That's something I haven't yet implemented, but something I've been thinking about as what would the right benefit be for someone to build up that streak.
It feels like there's also this element of streaks where they can be motivating until you miss them, and then they're like very demotivating because you kind of have to start from the beginning. It's something that I'm riffing on a lot, so we should definitely chat more about that at some point. I'd be really curious, to think about, Toronto. Toronto is a really beautiful city, and incredibly talented people there. What are some aspects? I know you've only been to San Francisco for a short time. What are some aspects? Everybody usually talks about the aspects that people wished were kind of exported from San Francisco and brought to other cities. What are some aspects of Toronto that you wish might be imported to San Francisco?
That's a fun question.
And I want to give you the caveat and give the audience the caveat that you've only been here for 4 or 5 days or something, so not expecting you to have the silver bullet. But what are some things that you really like about Toronto that you feel like would be amazing for other cities to have?
So I think one of my favorite parts about Toronto is that it's very culturally diverse. I think a result of that is that there's not too much groupthink because there are a lot of recent immigrants. There are a lot of people who come from all over Canada because Toronto is the hub for Canada. And there are a lot of people who also just have completely different ambitions. I think San Francisco is awesome because of the density of talent and technology. But I also think that there is this concept of like a Silicon Valley bubble in that there is this like view of success that I'd say a lot of people hold as like similar. Whereas in Toronto, I think there is a lot more diversity because it's in Canada, it's the tech hub, it's also the finance hub, it's also like the film hub. So there's a lot of diversity that results in people not being afraid to pursue things that are maybe outside of technology. And I think that's really valuable because it means that there is no like kind of like bubble groupthink attitude. And like for San Francisco, that's a positive and also a negative. It's really difficult to say which parts I would like to import without ruining like the Bay Area culture. But that's the thing I definitely love about Toronto.
Very cool. Well, I don't know, Ari, if you have any final questions here. Maybe one last one for me before maybe Ari you close things out. I'd just be super curious to hear when you think about the brain drain or whatever term people are using here. How do you think about your personal plans? Like, what's the ideal situation for you? Are you interested in staying in Canada? Are you interested in moving to San Francisco, somewhere else? Are you still figuring that out? What's on your mind as it relates to that? And maybe also what's on the people that you're friends with, their minds, when they're in Toronto?
Yeah, for sure. So right now I'm in college right now in the US, and I get a really interesting perspective here because at my school, it's very diverse in the sense that people are from really all over the country and the world, but primarily all over the country. Like there's no more than 10% of people from a specific state. So that is cool because it shows me the value of places beyond just what I thought were like the best places to be, San Francisco and Toronto and New York. I love Toronto as a city, and I'll likely end up moving back there long term. But because of this perspective I have now, where the country and North America is huge and there are a lot of places to be, I do want to explore for sure. For me, like I do want to return to San Francisco for some of my like summers or potentially gap year because I think that there's a lot to learn still when it comes to building and focusing on kind of like my craft in that sense. But there's also a whole world out there. So I absolutely want to travel, want to continue maybe trying out other places to live. I can't give you a concrete answer just yet, but I have a rough idea of that outline.
And you spoke about how some of Toronto's like best aspects might not be like best to sort of import into San Francisco because San Francisco is so much so its own thing. Nothing else is San Francisco. But I'm curious, flipping it around, you spent 4 days in the city. How were you able to bring maybe some small pieces of San Francisco back into Toronto and how you sort of lived life there, how you interacted with others, and how you built stuff there?
Yeah, I think the coolest thing is like this idea of specificity in San Francisco. Like you don't want to waste people's time, because in San Francisco people are working incredibly hard. What I learned from that is that if you're going to spend time with someone who is potentially a founder of a company where they're working these like crazy weeks, you want to be able to provide value in addition to just take value as like a young person. So like back in Toronto and even now in college, I'm very intentional about trying to provide value as much as possible and also being very specific, because I think I've learned like the value of people's time and that people are like, often doing you a favor by meeting with you as a young person. So keeping it as like a mutual beneficial relationship is like the biggest thing I've learned, and I want to continue to do that going forward.
Awesome. What a great place to wrap. I think there are a ton of gems to get to for people listening to this. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Ari. Thank you, Julian. I appreciate it.
Cheers.